Hey, Guoba here, back again so soon. I've seen a ton of misconceptions and misinfo spreading about Cipher, whether that be in my comments, Discord, or just around Reddit when I'm doom scrolling. She's a brand new character, and it's fine to not understand how a character works, but that's why I'm making this video, which I didn't initially plan on doing. This is not targeted at anyone because it was just a bunch of random comments I thought about and noted down. All I hope is that it helps people understand her better. First, a lot of people make the mistake about her ultimate. The big damage from her ultimate is from her talent, her A2, and her A4. It is recorded damage from your team. If your team does 100,000 damage to the patron specifically, Cipher will have 24,000 damage she can unleash during her ultimate. That's also what the coins signify. One coin is 1,000 damage stored by Cipher. That means her ult is not the highest priority to level, as all leveling her ult does is upgrade her small attack multipliers. And so, since it records your team's damage, and because it is true damage, it is not amplified by any buffs. The damage your team does is amplified by buffs, and that will be recorded, but we'll see why that also doesn't change much. So no, we do not run the Valorous set on Cipher because she has a big ult nuke. All that would do is buff the small attack multiplier damage we do. True damage is unaffected by buffs. And no, we do not have to crit because the crits already happened in our team to deal damage and we recorded that. And then people think her damage recording is not just a damage amplification effect. If you don't know from the RMC or Tribi video releases, true damage is unaffected by any modifiers, crit, damage, vulnerability, etc. But at the same time it kinda is, because true damage so far is based on allies doing damage. When RMC gives a hypercarry 30% true damage, you'll do an extra 30% of your damage again on every attack. This is the same thing as giving you an undiluted 1.3 times multiplier. So it's the exact same thing as giving you a 30% vulnerability, provided there is no vulnerability debuff pre-existing in the fight. True damage is much rarer, so it feels better and usually is, but it is still just another multiplier like any other. When true damage becomes abundant, we might even get another new multiplier in the future. Going back to Cipher, when she records 24% of the damage you deal to the patron, and then you spit it out later, that is similar to as if you amplified your team's damage by 1.24 times, except you keep that damage you would have amplified. So it's similar to, for example, giving your team 24% vulnerability in a vacuum, but you keep the damage gains they get from this vulnerability debuff. So, if I did 100,000 damage to the patron, Cipher can unleash 24,000 damage. If I did 100,000 damage and got a 24% vulnerability debuff without any other vulnerabilities present, I do 24,000 extra damage during my attack. Cipher's talent is a damage amp you get to save. So does that mean the more buffs the better, the more supports the better, the more damage the better, the more Eidolons on my team the better? Whale bait. Nope, 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 nope. First off, her kit functions perfectly well at E0S0 and E0S1, just like other recent supports. Now, if you read her damage recording, she does not record overflow damage. That means she does not care if you did 10 billion damage to an enemy if the enemy only has 1 million HP. She will only record 24% of that 1 million health bar that was deleted. She does not care if your Acron is E0 or E6 or you're using the brand new OP DPS. The enemies have their own HP and you cannot go past it for Cipher's recording. This is another reason why her build doesn't matter that much outside of speed breakpoints, guaranteeing EHR, and that's because your recorded damage will be the same whether it's Cipher that does a bit of damage or your main DPS one-shotting the weak enemies. It is still good to get damage on her though to clear wave 1 faster, kill side enemies, and help the DPS centralize their damage on the patron for better damage recording, but yeah. So, for example, our current MOC, Banana Boss side wave 1. The Sanctus Medicus dude has 1 million HP, the Blazers have 830k HP each, and the side enemies the Sanctus Medicus dude summons have 100k HP each, 150k counting the revive. The maximum damage without overflow you could do to these enemies is the sum of their health, so nearly 3 million health. And so the maximum recorded damage you can get from Cipher is 715k damage. No matter who you use in this fight, the tally Cipher records will be pretty similar, because she records damage done, but not overflow. And so every team will have to do this 3 million damage whether it's in a 0 cycle or 2 cycles. Now, we won't actually get 715k damage stored because your DPS are probably doing side damage to the non-patron enemies, and that isn't recorded at 24%, it's recorded at 16%. The only way to maximize coin gain is to technically maximize your patron state and only put all your big damage on the patron one enemy at a time. You can also wait for enemies to be summoned, as that's more damage to tally. But both of these methods are counterintuitive to clearing fast, and so basically most teams will have a similar amount of tally on Cipher, E0 DPS or E6 Whale DPS. 10 million damage in 2 hits to a 3.5 million health boss, or 3.5 million damage done over a cycle, you would have the same tally if it was that boss and that boss alone. And so does that mean she's bricked since she's kinda capped by HP? Also no. If you had a better damage amper, you could still be overkilling and losing out on damage gains regardless. You're not ulting on wave 1 anyway usually, so you just get free damage for wave 2 that no other amper has access to. In fact, Cipher avoids overkill better than any support I feel like because you can finish the fight with her ult after saving up a bunch of damage. If we go back to that MOC and we save the max of 715k damage from wave 1, we could immediately unleash 715k damage onto wave 2. We'd actually want to keep saving and nuke the second phase ideally, but anyways. What this wave 1 damage save does, lets us reduce the enemy's HP by 715k for free, and then Cipher keeps on tallying up damage for another ult. Whereas, a 24% vulnerability wave 1 would have just given us extra damage for wave 1, and then the same buff for wave 2. So Cipher would start the fight wave 2 not at 6.7 million enemy health, but at around 6 million at max potential, 89% of the original value. And then she can keep on recording for a second ult. Again, we should save the ult ideally, but this is just for explaining the power of her talent. If we take a different example now, say a single target only boss with 5 million HP. If we say that they don't spawn any enemies just for simplicity's sake, the way Cipher works means we don't actually have to do 5 million damage. Again, a better amper can also make you kill faster, but now we also have wave 1's contributions. So the enemy HP left is 5 million minus X. The damage recorded is 0.24x on the patron. So for the damage recorded to be equal to the HP left, we do 0.24x equals 5 million minus X. This gives us X equals the boss health divided by 1.24, and that is 4 million damage, without wave 1. This means we only have to do 4 million damage to this boss with Cipher at 0 tally at the start of wave 2 in order for her ult tally to equal enough damage to finish them off. But now, we can add wave 1's contributions. If we add the 715k from earlier just for simplicity's sake, even though it shouldn't be that high, we would have around 4.3 million health on this boss if we ulted immediately. So we will save the ult, but that means we can act as if they have 4.3 million health. Doing the same formula, and we have 3.46 million damage needed on this boss to then one-shot with Cipher ult. So despite having 5 million health, all we need to do is 3.46 million and then ult on Cipher for her to blow them up at peak potential, so we would only have to do 69% of the original health value. And again, please do not misunderstand this as not being damage amp, as it is just taking from wave 1's supposed damage amp. It is still a damage amp from Cipher's side. For example, if we didn't save wave 1's contributions, we'd have to do 4 million damage for Cipher to kill him. A DPS that does 4 million damage could also do the 5 million damage needed for the boss, provided he had an extra damage amp increase of around 1.25 times over Cipher from a different support. So, for example, an amper that gives 25% respen on top of 40% vulnerability or something. But this does also mean her amp is better than stated in small little multiply calculations that you've seen. I also did it in my video. If you save damage from wave 1, her amp at E0S0 is 1.4 times on wave 1, which is horrendous. But that means her damage amp on wave 2 is 1.4 times multiplied by somewhere in between 1.16 times and 1.24 times, and then added on top the damage from wave 1. This makes her stronger in wave 2 than I think any AoE damage amper we have right now damage-wise, not utility-wise though. With the example from earlier, you needing to only do 3.46 million damage rather than 5 million is equivalent to a 1.45 times damage amplification at max, but less realistically and specific to this example. That brings her E0S0 damage amp in this specific scenario to 2.03 times on wave 2. which is vastly superior to E0 S0 Trebi's 1.6 times or Jiaocho's 1.35 to 1.5 times. A stronger Wave 1 means a better amp in Wave 2, and a weaker Wave 1 means a weaker amp, but still strong nonetheless. Now, this is specifically for MOC with the two wave states, but there could be a similar effect in two-phase apocalyptic shadows that have harder mechanics on phase 2. You trade a weaker first half for a destructive second half of a fight. Though, this is why I think she could be tier 0 in MOC, but maybe only something like tier 0.5 in Apocalyptic Shadow. Furthermore, she works like E1 Tribute in the way that her exact damage amp in a fight can be a certain number, but the damage amp specifically on a target you need to kill can be higher. If Flame Reaver spawns a bunch of his shadow friends, you'll have to kill them anyway. You can have an amper that buffs your AoE damage to kill all these enemies, but the side ones are significantly weaker than the main boss. Cipher instead records that AoE damage you're dealing to kill the side enemies, but then lets you unleash it onto the boss. People comparing E1 Tribute to the Holy Grail need to realize that Cipher's talent has a similar effect. But then a final misconception that could come from all this is that she scales on enemy HP and is future-proof. She does not scale on enemy HP like a bleed dot can, for instance. Just because she is capped by enemy HP does not mean she scales with it. In the future, if a wave 1 has 10 million health, yes, she can technically record 2.4 million damage at max, but as we saw earlier, we could just have an amper that buffs our damage by more than 24% on top of the 40% vulnerability in her A6, and that will probably happen by the time we get 10 million health wave 1s. Anyways, I think that's all the mistakes I found or at least remembered. Thanks for watching, thanks to my beautiful YouTube members, and have a Guoba day.